and welcome to the 31st Historic Calgary Week. I would like to thank you for attending Behind the Scenes with Mapmakers. We're fortunate tonight to have a panel discussion. Our panelists are Shaun Hunter, Kevin Allen, and Jim Ellis. The panel will be moderated by Asia Walker. Shaun Hunter is the author of Calgary Through the Eyes of Writers, a literary tour of the city from its frontier beginnings to contemporary times. Her latest project, a digital literary map of Calgary, marks more than 500 sites in the Calgary storied landscape. Shawn served as the 2020 historian in residence at the Calgary Public Library. She shares her passion for Calgary's literary landscape on guided walks, talks, and on her website at www.shawnhunter.ca. Kevin Allen is a fourth-generation Calgarian who has been documenting and profiling queer people and events for 30 years. Kevin started the Calgary Gay History Project in 2012 to uncover and preserve stories from Calgary's LGBTQ2's past, and that's at www.calgarygayhistory.ca. The project has achieved national recognition and led to the award-winning documentary film, Gross Indecency, The Everett Flippert Story, and the best-selling book, Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary. Additionally, Kevin works as a senior election administrator for both Elections Canada and Elections Alberta. Jim Ellis is a professor of English at the University of Calgary and director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, Canada's oldest humanities institute. The CIH has acted as a bridge between the university and the community for over 40 years, promoting the values of humanistic inquiry and civic conversation. As director of the CIH, Jim has produced a trilogy of books that explore environmental issues from a Western Canadian perspective, including the voices of artists, writers, activists, and academics. The trilogy comprises Calgary, City of Animals, Water Rights, Reimagining Water in the West, and most recently, Intertwined Histories, Plants in Their Social Contexts. He has also published widely on literature, art, and film. Asia Walker is the Heritage Resources and Research Coordinator of Heritage Calgary. She holds a Master of Planning degree from the University of Calgary's Faculty of Environmental Design and a BA Honors in English, also from the University of Calgary. Asia's interests lie at the intersection of heritage preservation and modern development, urban design, social infrastructure, and storytelling. She strives to lay a foundation for the exploration of all forms of heritage, our buildings, our landscapes, our ancestors, and our traditions. Asia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Irene, for that wonderful introduction. Really great to be here tonight with Historic Calgary Week. I am Asia Walker with Heritage Calgary. I will be steering the ship tonight and keeping our chief captains and bottle washers all in line, directing some questions to our panelists. I hope everyone is all settled in after a busy day and has something to drink. I have a bottle of soda water that will keep me hydrated throughout our presentation. I hope you have something yummier at hand to enjoy. So since we started with introductions and bios, and we've introduced our panelists now quite fulsomely, I would say, to the audience tonight, I think we'll dive right into questions. I would like to really get this conversation going, and I do want this to be really more of a conversation. So Shawn, Jim, Kevin, if and when you feel like responding to one of the questions that I ask, or if something one of the other panelists say inspires you and you'd like to comment on it, by all means, please jump in. I really hope that we can keep this really light and conversational and see where we go from there. So start with a pretty straightforward question here. All three of you are involved in the world of map making and telling stories through this really traditional way of sharing information. So Shawn, I'll start with you. Your map, the literary literary history map of Calgary explores all kinds of different stories. How did you set out to find the stories for your map, and where did you find them? Were there any major surprises on your research adventures?
Well, I thank you, Asia. It's great to be here with you all, and thanks to everyone in the audience for coming out tonight. Yes, I have many sources. I had just come out of publishing my book Calgary Through the Eyes of Writers in 2018, so I had loads of stories and research that I was not able to include in the book, but it was perfect for a map. Another really pivotal thing that happened during my residency early on was the Calgary Library made available the Calgary Herald archive digitally. And so that all of a sudden made research that in other times would have involved going to a place and rolling through the microfilm, which is not, I can think of many other things I'd rather do. All of a sudden, at my fingertips were the Calgary Heralds from way, way, way back to the beginning. And my goodness, back in the day, the Calgary Herald included things like street addresses for people that they were writing about. Mapmakers gold. So I would say that was just an amazing resource to have available quite recently.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I just wanted to share on the screen here a picture of one of your map. This is a really creative way of getting into sharing stories and storytelling. I'll be sharing some visuals throughout the evening just to support what our panelists say as well. So thanks so much for that, Shawn. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you next. Same question. How did you set out to find the stories for your map? It's a creative and maybe sometimes very complex history that you're telling. Where did you find those stories? And I guess maybe just to deviate briefly from what I asked Shawn, why did you think that telling those stories through a map format was the best way to go about it?
Well, I think I'm sort of an accidental map maker, perhaps, and an accidental historian. When I started the project in 2012, I didn't know anything about Calgary's queer history. I started by age profiling people at the Pride Parade and Pride Festival, saying, "Are you from Calgary?" and scared a lot of people. And but eventually broke into the elder community, and they started telling me their stories. And early on in the project, I was invited to do a James Walk, 2013, I think, the next year, and I started developing these gay history walks that became quite popular. And if I have an activist bent to my work, it's all about claiming space in the city, and the queer communities had a quieter voice historically, absolutely. And so it's asserting that we were here, and I really like taking people on these walks and showing the places where we, I guess, recreated, where we had bars and institutions, peer support organizations, etc. Where significant historical events happened to our community. I like putting things in a landscape and showing how they're all related. And I didn't actually think about making a map. I think Jim maybe approached me at that point and said, we've got this thing called the Calgary Atlas Project. We're thinking about doing alternative maps of Calgary. And, the history walk would probably be really nicely adapted to a map. And so then that was the origin of that, Mark Klintberg did the art, which is amazing. He was really inspired by the History Project's work. And so he was like taking words, images of stuff, artifacts that I had uncovered. And then he did this queer map, like it's not oriented in a traditional north-south way. It's got a really abstract look to it. So I was really thrilled to work with Jim and the Calgary Atlas Project.
Yeah, it's something I definitely noticed about the map the first time I saw it is that, Center Street is there. You see it on the screen now. Center Street is there and it runs sort of on an angle across the map. It's certainly not as straight, I guess you would call it, now that I'm thinking about these words. it's not as, traditional as a map that you might look like. So Jim, maybe you want to comment on the layout of these maps, and maybe tell us a little bit about the Atlas project through the university and how you and your team come up with the different map subjects. This one, and then we'll also talk about the First Nations Stampede map as well.
Sorry, unmute myself there. As Irene said, the Calgary Institute for the Humanities exists at the university both to promote humanistic research, so research into English, history, art, literature, religion, philosophy, but also to promote the study and in the community at large and to provide a bridge. And so the Atlas project in some ways serves both of those aims. So we're a group of 5 professors, some in history, one in media studies and film, one in architecture. And we decided we wanted to put together an alternative atlas of the history, sort of based of the city, sort of based on Rebecca Solnit's work. She's done these amazing atlases of San Francisco, of New York, of New Orleans. We quickly abandoned the idea of a book. It was just going to take too long and be too difficult. And so we thought about, let's do individual maps. And so we wanted to do maps of forgotten or marginalized or alternative histories of the city that would illuminate the character of the city in a different way and perhaps a surprising way, something that would cause people to see the city differently. So the first map we decided to produce is Kevin Allen's map, of course. It was sort of to hand in a way. I'd been on one of his great walks, I think 2 actually. And we decided to hire, to approach Mark Klintberg to do this, who is a queer artist working at the Alberta University of the Arts. I bring this up because with all of the maps, we try as hard as we can to get people involved in those histories, both to do the research and tell the stories, but also an artist from those communities or that particular community to interpret that history in cartographic form. So what results, you can see from the queer map, is you're probably not going to be able to use this on your daily commute to get around the city. It is about an artistic interpretation of the history. Although almost every map we've done has the bow running through it. I think that's the common denominator. Even with the wildest ones, we've still got the bow and usually the elbow. So the second map we decided on, we had wanted to do an Indigenous map or a map with Indigenous content, but we also, of course, wanted to take on some of the stories that Calgary tells and tell that story differently. And there's, in some ways, no more central story than the story of the Stampede. But what many people perhaps don't realize is how intimately involved First Nations have been from the very first Stampede in 1912. George Weedick, who put on the Stampede, really wanted the First Nations there. He had to argue all the way up to Ottawa to get them permission to attend. And so we thought, let's try to document that history, which I think could surprise people in some ways. So we did the research. And then we turned that research over to Adrian Stimson, who is an internationally respected but local Governor General's award-winning artist from Siksika Nation. It turned out that Adrian had been fascinated with both the Stampede and map making since childhood. So he set out to do a traditional map. He was working with watercolors, and he said the watercolor in the paper just resisted him. So he came back to us and said, could I do it on a buffalo robe? And will you pay for the buffalo robe? And we said, absolutely. And so he produced this phenomenal buffalo robe map instead, which is currently on display at the Glenbow. So you can go and see it until the Glenbow closes for renovations. So as with Mark Klintberg and the queer map, Adrian interpreted the history. And in particular, he used the model of First Nations story robes and also winter count maps. So time is told in a spiral rather than in a kind of two-dimensional cartographic space that we're used to in the West. So the stories kind of spiral outwards towards the edges of the map, although he still has a nice representation of the two rivers and also the railway line, which is important to that particular history as well.
Yeah.
The third map, which just came out a month ago, is the history of alternative art in the city. Again, I think a topic that might surprise Calgarians is how rich the history of art is in the city. It's perhaps not something that we're known for, and yet it's an incredibly vibrant scene that's been basically since the Second World War has been churning away with tiny galleries and spaces and events popping up all over the city. Local curator Diana Sherlock did a vast amount of research on this scene, and then we much of it had to be put onto our website, but we distilled it down into 4,000 words for the back of the map. The front of the map is done by the alternative art collective Drunken Paw, a trio of artists who always work on 3 drawings at the same time. So they produce 3 different maps. We had to choose one, unfortunately. But they started with a map. Each drawing starts with a 1927 map of the city that then they drew on top of, and they would each switch around between the 3. And again, produced a kind of interpretation of that history in cartographic form. But if you look in very closely at various points of the illustration, you can in fact see the map coming through.
Yeah, it's this one here is just so visually striking to me. It's such a creative way of sharing, information that would be, if it was in a report or something like that, that it just wouldn't be expressed in the same sort of way, Shawn, I think I'll come back to you with this next question then, as we start talking about sharing these stories and more of these intangible aspects of our history, how did you decide which stories in the end to include on the map? I mean, you talked about the resources that were available to you, but you must have ended up with just a wealth of information. How did you start to whittle it down and decide which stories to choose from? And I'll set up a follow-up question. The image of the Indigenous map is so striking and is done in such a unique way. What is sort of the next evolution, do you think, for your map, lifting it off of the page per se and maybe putting it out in the world? What would you like to see in the future for your research in a map sort of form?
Mm-hmm. I would love for the Atlas project to take a look at a literary map of Calgary. There you go. So which stories? Well, I actually started the residency thinking I would focus on the 100 or so sites from the City of Calgary's inventory of evaluated resources. That's a list of about a database of about 800 and more or less sites. And I had found about 100 had literary connections. So I thought for the purposes of my 6-month residency, that I would focus on those 100. Well, of course, my 6-month residency ended up being 10 months because of the pandemic. And so I started to think I was kind of focusing on that in the last little bit of my residency, thinking, okay, do I really have to narrow it down? No, I do not, because I'm using a digital platform. And so I can dump as much stuff as I want onto Google My Maps and it will be okay. So instead of going narrow, I decided to go wider. And that allowed me to have a lot of fun. So I could cover the 100 sites. I could also add a whole bunch of other stories that I had sitting there, including, a lot of serious literary history, well-researched and documented, and also pins like Traveling Light, the giant blue ring, which is kind of a literary piece of public art because the giant blue ring has a Twitter handle and is, I don't know who it is, but has given a literary voice, a written voice to that piece of public art. The giant blue ring is on the literary map of Calgary. So I went really wide. When the map was released in February, I think I had about over 500 pins. And I just counted yesterday, and there are now 564 pins. And I've added about 40 since it came out, and I have a file folder full of other stuff, more stuff. So I can just keep going and going and going. And I will, because it's, I don't know, once you start building a map, it's really addictive and so fun, the sleuthing and the connections. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Next steps. Well, I collected a lot of, some places in Calgary are super storied, I would say. For instance, the Palliser Hotel, the Central United Church, the Memorial Park Library, other places like this. I couldn't condense those stories onto my map, and I didn't want to, because maps are not books. And you can put bits of text in, and the Atlas Project does a brilliant job of that, because on the back of those maps are all the stories, but you can't put the full story down there. So perhaps some of this map work will lead to possibly another book. I'm thinking a literary companion to Calgary, organized by geography, and maybe many little maps inside that book. One of my inspirations for this project is the work being done in the Vancouver Public Library with their Literary Landmarks program. It came out of a book that was published in 1986 by Alan Twigg. And 20 years later, the library put some energy and some funds behind it. And so you can go to the website. It's quite limited. I think there are about 30 pins. They are adding new pins, but they haven't gone wild like mine, because of their map program is connected to plaques. And I say plaques, but I've seen them. They're wrapped around, there's a picture, they're wrapped around light posts. So they're not super expensive, I don't believe. They're not bronze plaques. And wouldn't that be wonderful if we could get some more heritage marking in this city, and certainly some more literary sites marked. So that's an aspiration. We'll see. We need some money. We need some, it'd be lovely if the Calgary Library came on board. I know they want to, but we need to line some things up. So yes, I see that happening. I hope it happens.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I interject there?
Yeah.
So I just want to give a shout out to Shawn, because I feel like we have similar missions, just with a different sort of community. But Shawn came and saw me in the Calgary Public Library in 2018 and said, "Oh, do you know about this gay author? Do you know about this queer author?" And of course I didn't, because I'm not as pin savvy, maybe, or pin set. Like, I love that Shawn just like maxes it out, like just gets it, like accumulates everything and then, digests it. And she said, here's all the queer authors and queer spaces. And so that really fleshed out some of my work in the Queer History Project. And also I've been on Shawn's History Walk, Jane's Walk in the Beltline, and a lot of the queer community's histories in the Beltline. So it's interesting to see the overlaps between literary history and queer history. And I think more people should be doing this kind of work so that we can make all these connections.
And it's really interesting to see even these 3 Atlas Project maps. They're talking to my map in very specific ways. A Woman's Place bookstore is on your map, Kevin.
Yeah.
And that's on my map. Slightly different focus, but same site. On the First Nation Stampede map, there's a mention of Longlands. Longlands was involved in the mock kidnapping of the mayor in 1923. Longlands was a literary figure in Calgary in the 20s. And of course, rolled a bomb into City Hall, a fake bomb, in 1922. And they invited him back for the Stampede. So the Stampede story is on the First Nation Stampede map. And then the underground art map, there's a place called the Parachute. Do you remember what it's called? The Parachute Center for Cultural Affairs on 10th Street in Kensington. And that connects with a little tiny magazine called Vortex that I discovered in the Calgary Herald that ran a monthly poetry festival in 1979 at Ambrosia Restaurant in the Clarence Block on Stephen Avenue. I've since tracked down the person who ran that magazine. She's now in Vancouver, and that's just been really wonderful to fit that in. So this map really ties in, and Clouds and Water Gallery is on this map, also a literary site in the 70s and early 80s. So these maps, but these stories, these hidden histories are all connected in a way. It's so cool, very cool.
It has been interesting to me as well to see buildings and sites show up in very different contexts in the very different map projects, to know how important, for example, Hull's Opera House was in early 20th century Calgary history, both for art, but also it was a place for labor activism.
Right. And it's where Pauline Johnson gave a charity performance in the late 1890s.
Wow.
For the Holy Cross Hospital, right? Like, yeah, and more.
That is fantastic. The intersectionality of the stories and how this kind of research and historical investigation kind of brings all of these stories to the surface. I'm gonna advance I've been given some softball questions here, but I think what I'm going to do is going to level this up now to 2.0. Something that we're grappling with in our in our industry generally as well when it comes to heritage. I mean, heritage in Calgary, I think in particular, everyone sort of thinks of the building, right? The old building, that is heritage. I can wrap my mind around that idea of heritage. But our industry, and I would include the three of you in this as well as historic storytellers, I really feel like right now we're at a crossroads when it comes to how we present our city's history, the heritage we choose to focus on, the stories we choose to share and continue to share and elevate, and who is asked to tell these stories. All of your maps and the maps of Calgary Atlas, the series of them, present history in a unique way or share those kind of more uncelebrated aspects of our city's past. Do you think that map making in this way, and maybe you can expand on your thoughts behind it, in this more creative map making tradition can help broaden the diversity of heritage in Calgary through the storytelling, as we've talked about, but helping uncover even more and more of these sort of uncelebrated aspects of the city's past?
There are a lot of people doing historic map storytelling in this town. I would say it's flourishing. Chinook Country Historical Society, if you go to the website, and we'll put it it is in the list of links that we'll share at the end, has a lovely page called Virtual Experiences, Historic Experiences in Calgary, Jewish Historical Society, Jewish History Map. There's a one from the Deep South, I believe. The fellow behind that, I can't remember his name, Mark, did a presentation a few days ago. So rich. We have the tools. Anybody can can tell the story with a map. I don't believe we used to have the tools. We're also, I think, in a moment in our history where, yes, a new city, a young city, and yet we've never been this mature before. And we're at a time we're interested. There's a new curiosity about this place. We're also in not a economic boom, and we're in a boom period. It's manic, it's tunnel vision, et cetera, et cetera. We're in a period of sustained reflection, I think. So there's lots of voices, there's lots of stories, and where are the gatekeepers? Like, I didn't have to ask anybody's permission to create a digital literary map of Calgary. I just did it. So it's really fruitful, and I think it's very exciting, very exciting.
And there's something I would say about the map itself, about the technology of the map, that makes these heritages more quickly and more obviously and tangibly available to the imagination. I mean, I love books. I'm a literary person, but there's something about, so reading history of something is great, but having that history spread out in front of you in the place where you live, and showing you that actually something happened here on that corner, or there used to be a building over here, and in that building, the CCF was formed, or something like this. I think that that's one of the attractive features of maps, is they make the heritage come alive and also make it very tangible. This happened in the space where you are right now, as opposed to way back in the distant, in the distant reaches of time. And I think, as Shawn has said too, I mean, this city has a fairly established set of stories it tells about itself. The oil patch, entrepreneurs, ranchers, all of the things that are kind of summed up by Jason Kenney's blue pickup truck. And those established stories, I think they're true, and they're worth telling, but I think in some ways they have been told, and they also maybe crowd out other stories. So I think it's very useful to be reminded of all of the histories that formed this city, and that brought this city into being, and that have perhaps become lost because the buildings have become lost, or the site has changed. And that sort of history has drifted away. But I think that there is a new energy in the city for telling these different stories, and for remembering what happened where. One of the upcoming maps, I think, in the fall for us is going to be a history. We're going to try to do a sort of smallish history of waves of immigration, told by looking at the restaurants and the groceries of International Avenue, as different groups came, established their restaurants and grocery stores, and then sort of moved elsewhere into the city. But that's a very rich ethnic area, or very rich for ethnic history in the city. And again, it's a story, I think, that it's not obvious to the eye, but when it's spread out before you in a map, I think it comes alive.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Shawn, not asking for permission is kind of a very Calgary thing to do. So, I think maps can unlock new vistas for us. And what Jim was saying, the resonance of it's in your own backyard. Like, I live in the Beltline. A lot of my queer history stuff is in the Beltline. Shawn does the literary tour of the Beltline. It makes you feel more connected to the place that you live in. And I really like this idea of layers of history, and that there can be different communities' histories all coexisting in the same space. Club Carousel, which is where Home and Away bar is at 1207 First Street, was the first gay club, Club Carousel, but it's also where Joni Mitchell had her first paid performance in 7 years before that, in '63. And so, the owners of Home and Away were really interested to learn about the history of the building that they are leasing, and they've preserved it, and they have kind of monumentalized it in the basement where Club Carousel was. So I think people are more interested now in learning about the past, and not just raising the buildings and just Calgary of the new, Calgary of the future. We're being more contemplative now.
And we're also riding the waves of locavorism, I think. Growing up here in the 60s and 70s, nothing local was cool, like nothing. And I think I track it back to the food, local food, and City Palette magazine. That's where it really started here in the mid-90s. And all of a sudden, that carrot grown a couple blocks over, that's a better carrot than the one they shipped in from California. Breweries, craft breweries, massive local, we're riding that wave. It's cool to be local, and that's having an impact in heritage, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that all of those things, from food to art to and different forms of art, like clothing and different sort of ways that we consume art. All of those things are now helping us form an identity, I think, as Calgarians. And it's, we are not just the oil and gas city. We're not just the Stampede, the Red Mile, et cetera, et cetera. We do have this layered and complex history, and being able to, unearth and share these stories, I think, provides almost like a welcome, almost like a safe harbor for more and more people to see themselves reflected in this place, that has existed for very much longer than, the 137 years that the city has been a city. We are grounded here in so many ways, and people throw out a lot that, yes, we are a young city, but we do have roots. They go beyond the colonial buildings that we plop down on land that may be razed and may disappear over time. And I think that those stories and that sort of intangible aspects of our history, that's what lingers, and that's what kind of comes through, and what really helps define us as people, whether we're from Vancouver or from Calgary or from Edmonton or Regina, wherever we come from. So, okay, we've talked a lot about these stories. We've talked a lot about how the stories are, these are the elements that make up your beautiful maps. I want to know about some of these stories. So let's get into that. Kevin, I'll start with you. Did you have a favorite story on your map? Which one was kind of the most compelling, or the most, heart-wrenching, or the most interesting or complex to you? Which one was if this might be like choosing your favorite child, I don't know. But if you had to, what was the most compelling story for you, or your favorite at the end of the day?
Well, I'm gonna maybe give two answers to that question, because it is like choosing a favorite child. But Club Carousel was really, really important to the Calgary's to gay liberation in Calgary. It was sort of the dawn. I call it the dawn of the gay liberation movement. It was at 1207 First Street. I just referenced it. It's currently home and away. And one of the reasons it's also important to me is because I met early on in the project Lois Szabo, who's an 85-year-old Calgarian, who's one of the founders of that club. And she and I have become really good friends. Not every elder in our community really wanted to, be candid and talk about some of the painful aspects of the past for the LGBTQ2 community. And she was really forthcoming, and she's been involved in the community ever since. So that part of the map is really connected to Lois. And I'm so delighted to tell you, I don't know if you know this, but in the Beltline this past week, the Lois Szabo Commons was open. The city of Calgary, talking about acknowledging different histories, has created a public park in her honor. And Lois is very humble and very self-effacing. She says, "It's not my park, it's the community's park." And she feels, I talked to her about it because it just opened, and it's beautiful. I just saw it for the first time on Sunday night. It's beautiful. It's on the corner of 16th Avenue and 9th Street, sort of kitty corner from Cafe Bino. And where was I going with this point? Lois said that she loved it. And I remember. She said, we finally come out of the closet and come out of the underground. And she'd always wanted a building for the gay community, like a structure, like a safe place, a safe harbor to go to. But she thinks in this day and age, a park that is something that's open is more fitting. And so now I have to figure out how I'm going to get my gay history box to start or end there. It's kind of like out of the traditional loop. So that is my short story about Club Carousel.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, and seeing that park named after Lois, I think was an exceptional choice and completely fitting given the area of the community that it's in. So you did say you had a second, Kevin. Did you want to elaborate on that one?
Well, just 17th. So when I did my queer history, I was talking to a lot of elders, but I am old enough now that I have my own queer history, and so anything from like 1990 up is really colored by my own personal memories. And so this stops on 17th Avenue, 318, which is on the map. That was my bar, as a young person. When I was going to bars Friday nights, Saturday nights, like regularly, that is where I hung out. So I have a lot of fun memories and, first kisses and things like that at that place. So that's a personal queer history connection.
I love that. That's fantastic. It's nice to see yourself reflected in a map, right? In this case, it's your actual self. Like, that's amazing. Shawn, how about you? A favorite story, something that was really, fascinating? Is there a literary personality that you actually can't even believe came through Calgary or something like that?
I'm not going to tell the Leonard Cohen story again tonight.
Okay.
But that is a cool story.
Good teaser.
I think I gave you a slide for this pin.
Yeah.
And I have so many favorite pins, but the ones that I love the most are the ones that have all these tentacles of connection. And I gave a talk last fall called Adventures in Map Making, and the link is on the list. It's sort of one of those sort of, where it all took me. But this one I haven't talked about, and I have more writing to do about Sheila Watson, who wrote one of, considered the first modernist Canadian novel, The Double Hook. And she wrote that in Calgary. She was living in Rosedale with her poet husband, Wilfred, between 52 and 54, and she would walk along the Crescent Heights Ridge. It was a period of a great deal of struggle for her. Her marriage was falling apart. She was working on this book, and she would walk her dog, Dotto, on the ridge. And Dotto, in one of the biographies of Sheila Watson, has about, 9 different pages in the index. So Dotto was important. Dotto, the Watsons left Calgary. They were heading to Edmonton via Paris. And what would happen with Dotto? And she gave Dotto to Louise Riley, who was a very important figure in Calgary in the 50s. She was assistant librarian at the Calgary Public Library. She was the story lady. She was on radio broadcasts in the 40s. She had moved into the Athlone apartment block in Mission in 1950. I don't know how she and Sheila Watson met, but it was a small city then. Certainly the literary circle was very small, and I'm keeping an eye open for how that happened. They did meet, and Louise Riley took custody of Sheila Watson's German Pointer dog. That is not a picture of Dotto. It's just the closest I could come. But I just love that. So 2 pins, 2 sites just came alive for me. And I love dogs. There you go. Dotto the dog. And Sheila Watson loved dogs too.
It's fantastic. I love that visual of her walking Dotto along the ridge in Crescent Heights. That's just fantastic.
And her husband, Wilfred, also did that ridge. And Wilfred was teaching, the reason they were in Calgary is he was teaching at the University of Alberta at Calgary in the, where the Jubilee Auditorium is now, in war huts, army huts. And he was having an affair with a student.
Oh.
And he was also walking along Crescent Heights Ridge and wrote a poem that is anthologized, not in my book, but I think it's called Calgary, This Graveyard or something like that. So it figures in the Watsons' life for sure.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, the connections are just phenomenal. And, we talk about how our circles are small today, even in Calgary. I can imagine in the 50s, they were probably even smaller. Before I go to Jim and ask him, I'm not going to ask you, Jim, to speak to your favorite map because that would be scandalous, I think. Kevin, you had mentioned earlier that Shawn had come to you while you were in residence at the library and presented you with some her research about queer authors and the connections that you made onto your map. Maybe both of you want to speak a little bit to some of the queer authors that have been in the city, where they are located on either of your maps, or and how their stories maybe kind of brought you two together.
Yeah, I want to start, Shawn, just because I didn't know about Rupert Brooke, who was a British poet who came through Calgary kind of on a junket tour Canada and was writing a column back to London. And he fell in love with the Memorial Park Library. And he was queer. He was bisexual, I think. It's hard to say with history how to classify people sometimes. But this has happened to me a few times in my historic practice. I sort of fall in love with people who are dead. And so, you know, he was very handsome. And so for about 6 months, I was in love with him. And that is because of Shawn.
Just a minute. You fell in love with Rupert Brooke after I told you about his touchdown in Calgary?
Yeah, I actually scandalously didn't even know who he was until you told me about him. So.
Okay, but now you're really glad you do know who he is.
And I really, yeah. And so, yeah, I have posted stories about him on the Calgary Gay History, and yeah, he was a very fetching person.
Mm-hmm.
But not,
yeah. There's what else did I send you? I think I sent you Bruce Hunter, Calgary fiction writer, poet, who a story in his country music country collection that refers to gay bashing in Central Park.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've tracked down almost all of the sources that you gave me, and then of course you know, kudos to you in your book. You know, profiled queer authors, and I noticed on your map, like you even found where Sarah and Tegan, was it where they lived or something like that? And Suzette Mayer, who is a great writer. You include passages from her in your book, and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess we're creating queer history even as we speak, you know, like, so a next generation of Mapmaker might be, you know, referring to this panel discussion or something like that.
It's fantastic. Yeah. The connections are just so compelling, and I find it so interesting. So, Jim, we'll come to you here. Like I said, I don't want to ask you to pick your favorite project, your favorite map through the Atlas project so far, but maybe you can tell everybody and explain what your favorite story was on maybe the Stampede's in First Nations history map. And I'm pretty sure that you were pretty involved in that whole process. And if you'd like to share some of the topics of the upcoming Atlas project maps, and how you Shawn's kind of pitched one to you already, but how you decide to, and your immigration one, of course, but how you decide to go about selecting different topics for different maps through the project.
Sure. Well, so one of the, I'm just actually looking at the map because I can't remember this person's name, but it kind of matches up with Kevin's map. With the Stampede map, this young woman, Linda One Spot, who in the 1950s, she was a young girl, basically, who wanted to compete in the boys' events. And so she changed her name from Linda to Linder, which isn't, like a huge disguise. But nonetheless, she competed for 2 years in the boys' events and did fairly well, as far as I know. And then they brought in a rule, or I can't remember exactly why she was not allowed to compete anymore. But it's a lovely story. And there's another, I think her name was Anna Beaver, who decided she wanted to march in the Stampede Parade. So she formed a band of other young kids on her territory, and taught them how to play, and they marched at least 2 years in the Calgary Stampede Parade. So wonderful stories. So upcoming maps, the one that should appear next, I believe, is called Calgary Goes to the Movies, which documents both the old movie palaces that have come and gone, and also various screening organizations and film clubs, including one of Canada's longest running queer film festivals, Fairy Tales. This map was done by, people might not know this, we have in our midst 2-time Academy Award nominees, uh, Wendy Tilby and Amanda Forbes, who also have run a film festival for some time, the Bleak Midwinter Film Festival. So they did this phenomenal map. This is just one draft. It's not completely finished yet. That takes a lot of the facades of the old lost cinemas and puts them around the center of the city. I think people would be surprised if they were taken back to Calgary in the 1920s to know that Stephen Avenue had about 8 cinemas, huge cinemas that were astonishingly beautiful, that have come and gone. The saddest part of that map is just in every little entry. This was demolished in 1970. This was demolished in 1980. This came down, and so on. So that should appear next. Very soon after it is a map of Calgary's labor history called Workers Stand Up, which will be the subject of a panel this week, I think in a couple of days. MRU history prof Kirk Nygarth and local graphic artist Karen Jean Mills did the illustrations. And again, I think it would surprise people to know how much labor activism there is in this city. Cities are built, and they're built by workers, not necessarily just entrepreneurs. That's coming up next. And then the third map, which I'm hoping will be out by September, is a history of Calgary architecture in 40 buildings, which the text was done by architecture prof Graham Livesey, who is one of the members of the Calgary Atlas Project. And the illustration is being done by a local young architecture firm called Spectacle. And they're taking the lines of the Dominion Survey, so the initial lines that were sort of plonked onto Calgary Earth to lay out the city, and then they warp those lines according to various principles, and then are dropping on the facades of these 40 buildings. It should be, their name is Spectacle, and this should be a spectacular map. And then what I want to point to, I mean, this is sort of to talk to Shawn's point about the 60s. Nothing happened in the 60s. One of the ones we're hoping will appear next year is a history of Stampede wrestling. To look at the various people and places that were involved in what was a real Calgary phenomenon. And I think it'll expose not just, the craziness of Stampede wrestling, but also local television, when local television was much more important, local nightlife, and all of the kind of crazy, seedy places, and odd, interesting figures, like one that I learned about, Miss Stampede Wrestling, who was named Babette Bardot, who appeared at various times in the Stampede Parade, once memorably falling off the float. So hopefully, there's a lighter side to Calgary history as well, and to this particular project. Although I think it's interesting to know the seamier side of Calgary in the 60s and the 70s as well. That's also worth remembering. It's also part of our history, and it's also being lost.
Mm-hmm. I didn't say that nothing happened here in this. It's just that we didn't think it had much value.
Right.
But that Hart Mansion, that's the origin story of Stampede Wrestling, that house is still there. How many books have been written about the Harts? It's like a little literary hub there. It's unbelievable.
It's true. And they kept a bear under the front porch.
It's a novel waiting to be written.
Absolutely.
That's great. You've all spoken kind of to each other's maps and how these sort of overlap and interface with each other. But beyond each other's maps and the maps that you've created, I'll open this question, I guess, to all of you. Do you have other favorite Calgary maps? Maybe they are more traditional maps that, kind of show the Calgary that would have been. I think my favorite map of Calgary was the Thomas Mawson plan that everybody kind of discovers at some point in their urban planning, entry into Calgary. And you see how Civic Hall would have been at this entry point on Prince's Island or something like that. It's this most gorgeously compelling map that, of course, never got built. And really, some of the buildings that are on there were absolutely lost very quickly after that concept was created in the 1920s. But for each of you, are you inspired by other maps that you've seen, either of the history or of the history of Calgary, those more traditional sort of 1800s maps, or all the way up to just different ways of kind of interpreting the city that we haven't talked about yet tonight?
I'll jump in. Swerve Magazine several years ago, RIP, ran a beautiful feature of illustrators' maps of Calgary. And there's one I particularly like by Kyle Metcalf, and it's called Sweet Home Marlborough Park. And it's just a very idiosyncratic, this is the A&W, this is my elementary school, this is where we walk to here, and it's really lovely. And there was a whole series of them. There's a couple up on the screen from that issue. It's online. If you just type in illustrators maps of Calgary, I think the link is in the links. But I showed that to a group, some grade 5 students when I was at Historian in Residence. And wow, they're working on their own maps in class of their neighborhood. It's just like, I would have loved to have seen what they came up with, but they really responded not only to the Metcalf map, but also to, I must have been answering questions for 30 minutes. I live in Cedar Brae. Is there a story there, So anyway, but that childhood map of Kyle Metcalf's is very sweet and special. That's a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
I've got two. One is, and takes my childhood / young adulthood, was Calgary Transit bus map would come out once a year. And I rode a lot of transit back then in the day, and each route had a different color. And I just loved kind of, it was the city, but it was with all these streaks of color all around. And it was somehow just a wonderful thing and inspiring to think of all the places you could go. And number two is I was involved with a group called YYC Legacy Project, which was also a queer history thing. And they crowdsourced a map. They invited people from the queer community to talk about places that were memorable to them, kind of like Shawn's idea of putting pins in, and they literally would bring maps of Calgary and people would put pins in, and then they'd tell stories. And then they kind of amalgamated it into this sort of online discovery map of queer Calgary. So it wasn't one person's voice. It was, like 500 people's voice. So that was really an inspiring map.
Absolutely.
I would mention, this isn't a map in the conventional sense, but a project that I really loved that was at Esker, the Esker Gallery a while ago. A Calgary artist who is now based in Berlin, Larissa Fassler, who produces kind of emotional geographies of city spaces. So she's done this in Berlin and in Paris at the Gare du Nord, but she also did it in Calgary and a series of artworks called Civic Centre. And so what she does is she sits in a place or obsessively visits this place over 10 or 20 or 30 days, and she notes what she sees. The graffiti, the signs, the smells, the conversations, what people are wearing, if there are repeated things that she observes day after day. She measures the space with her body rather than with a yardstick. And so she produces a kind of sense of the space, which is often, spaces that are politically fraught in some way. So in the middle of Calgary, she maps the corridor around the old public library and City Hall. And the northern edge of the YWCA. So places where the homeless frequently are bumping up against city officials, people from the downtown having lunch, and so on. To sort of challenge the sense of the city and challenge the sense of these public spaces. What does a public space mean if it's policed in this particular way, if people can be there or not be there, and so on. There are phenomenal works of art, and I'd encourage you to look at her website for the various examples. And I think it's wonderful that this internationally successful artist who has done these projects in Paris and Berlin and New York has done it in Calgary as well. And we have this incredible set of artworks that I think perhaps the Esker doesn't own our work, but they're certainly available online.
Yeah, when you shared this visual on the screen now is the full map with kind of broken down into 3 sections that when I was just looking through I just found so attractive. Number 2 here, you've got a quote from Britney Spears, just the lyrics to Oops, I Did It Again. Drifting in over, her observation at 9 a.m. of 3 Black homeless men sleeping in chairs. And then over on this other side, there's no money, there's no budget. The governing factor is pedestrians will need to move the station. Like all of these different experiences sort of overlapping in this area where you do have such a collision of populations, people playing music, people who are houseless, who are perhaps, just enjoying the city the way it is right now. And then you've got, of course, the civic influence from City Hall coming out as well. Her observations about between 12:05, 12:25, people who are on their phone or looking at their phone, who's wearing headscarves, who's wearing suits, how many people are wearing glasses, how many are carrying coffees. This is such a compelling way of experiencing a space in a very creative and super untraditional way. This map is fantastic. And I'm so glad you were able to share the story of this, international now artist who was able to kind of create one of these for our little city. It's really fantastic.
I should mention actually that the person that wrote the text for our underground art map, Diana Sherlock, is also trying to put together a book on Larissa Fassler. So look for that in the coming years. That's another place where you could see this artwork.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, guys, it's 8:02 right now. We have a few more minutes to go before we open the floor to questions from the audience. So everyone who's listening, I hope that you are got your questions at the ready, and you please do share them in the Q&A component on the Zoom, just down in the bottom there. Before though we open it up to those questions, I think that my wrap-up question to all 3 of you would be sort of a call to action, let's say. What do we do? How can we continue to engage Calgarians to keep this conversation going? Shawn, you had mentioned previously that anyone really can make a map. Maybe the best thing to do from each of you would be to provide, what's that first step? If somebody wants to, has an idea for a map, or someone wants to, tell this series of stories in this sort of way, how would you explain to that person? Where would you send them first? What would you get them to do first? Is it the actual layout of the map? Is it consolidating the research? What would your advice be to somebody who's looking to kind of tell their own story through this way?
Well, to get a handle on what is the story you want to tell. Because I think these maps are all made with a very specific purpose. And so you got to be clear about your purpose, and then that will inform your scope. Research, you just need to tap into the Calgary Public Library. They're so fantastic there at Calgary Story if you want to do that kind of research. And then from the technological perspective, I would just Google, Google My Maps YouTube. That's what I did. And it is, there's a bunch of them out there, and they'll just take you through the steps. Put it up on Google. You can keep it private. You can share it. It's a nice kind of a worksheet. And it actually operates on a kind of a spreadsheet in the background. Just start there, and lead a Jane's walk. Get your map, just sketch it out, lead a Jane's walk. Nothing like a deadline to focus the research. And Jane's walks are amazing, and I really hope we can get back onto that. Historic Calgary Week is also wonderful. Those are just some initial suggestions. But yeah, don't forget about the Calgary Public Library. We have an amazing center at the University of Calgary, the Glenbow Western Heritage. Can't remember the full name of it anymore. I really hope I have never been to that new site, and it's been closed all this time, but it should be opening soon. And there's an amazing digital archive for that collection, so you can start. And the Herald archives are online. So just go narrow and then go wide.
Great advice, Shawn.
I think that's exactly my advice. I might add, when you're going narrow, is not to presuppose or preclude anything that might come your way. Because I talked about being an accidental map maker, but a lot of the stories that I've discovered in Calgary's queer history have been a little bit through happenstance. Like I've been going down one path and then something else happens. For example, on the Calgary Gay History Walks, or the Jane's Walks, I invite audience members just to stop me from talking for a minute to share their stories. And I always learn things about Calgary's queer history that I didn't know before the walk. And one thing that's unrelated to your question, but it would be remiss if I didn't mention, maps were so important to the queer community in its history when we were looking for safe spaces. So all the queer publications would, at the back or in the middle of their publication would be like, kind of, here's a queer map of Calgary. Here's where the bars are. Here's, the gay-friendly dentist. There's an example from Modern Pink in 1990. So they would create these maps sort of, every publication, there's a new one every few years with all those resources. So maps and safe places were important.
Great. Jim, any parting words of advice?
Sorry. Learn how to mute yourself. That would be one. No, I think that I would just encourage people to go to the library and go to these online resources as well. Map art is so astonishing. Both, actual geographic maps, or there's a whole series of the fire insurance industry used to put out maps every year that showed you what buildings were made of, which is important if you're an insurance company, I guess. But it's interesting to see in 1940, how many wooden buildings were there? There are all kinds of beautiful examples of maps. And I think expose yourself to that first in a way. But I think, as Shawn said, the story is the important thing. What actually are you trying to tell here? Because there's sort of no, the boundaries are always different depending on the story. The kind of boundaries that you want on the map, the kind of layers you want on the map, and so on. So the kind of history that you want to tell, or the kind of story that you're going to tell, is going to determine, I think, what the end product ends up looking like. And I guess, as Kevin said, be open to surprises. Be open to the idea that you might be wrong or misguided, and be delighted by that.
Yeah, great advice, absolutely, from all three of you. Thank you so much. Before we go, Kevin, I should give you a shout out for this. Is there something final you would like to say? I mean, you mentioned maps and safe spaces. That is absolutely an important thing. Shawn, Jim, is there anything else you'd like to convey to people before we open it up to questions from everybody else?
I would just say that I'm going to paraphrase an American writer, Edmund White, who came up with that term, flaneur, I believe. A city of 1 million people cannot be identified by one story. It's impossible. We've been a city of 1 million people since 2006. I think that's also part of this renaissance of map making. There are so many stories here, and you have to hold on to something positive, because these have been challenging times. Calgary's not done with its challenging times, but to me, the diversity and the multitude of stories in this place makes me get up with a spring in my step every day.
It's fantastic. I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you all so much for being so open and just generous with your sharing. It was really, really fantastic conversation. Thank you again. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go check in to our Q&A and see what we have to say here. So first question, what are you working on next? That's a great question, I think, for Shawn, Jim, and Kevin. Do any of you want to take that, whether it's related to the work that you're doing on your respective maps that we spoke about tonight, or just more broadly, I think, in your general research? What comes next?
Okay. I think part of my focus for the last couple of years, I co-curated an exhibit at Lougheed House about 1920s literary culture in Calgary, and there's still so much more to discover. I've been writing some pieces for a brand new initiative from the Alberta Book Publishers called Read Alberta. So we'll be writing more literary history pieces for them. And there's a big anniversary coming up in 2023. Winifred Eaton-Reeve, who was a Calgary writer here in the first decades of the 20th century. It's the centenary of her publication of her novel Cattle. And there's a whole little Winifred Reeve industry going on based at UBC, the Winifred Reeve Archive. The collection, her papers are at the University of Calgary Special Collections. So there's going to be, we hope, a conference here. I think it's calling for a map. There you go.
Yeah. Kevin, how about you?
I don't have a map in the future, but I'm working on a new film with the director that I did, Gross Indecency, about AIDS history in Canada, and that'll be coming out probably for World AIDS Day. And something I haven't broken, but I'm hoping to release for Pride. There's a UC Med student who's volunteering for the History Project, who's working on the Goliath bathhouse raid. So Goliath was on our queer history map. It was notable for being one of the last police raids of a bathhouse in Canada in 2002. And we're hopefully going to do something like this panel. Hopefully we're going to do it in person at Goliath, talking about the raid, invite the police, invite found-ins, that kind of thing. So we're creating a history event around that anniversary.
Wow. Jim, you kind of talked about your next maps that the Calgary Atlas Project is working on. Is there anything else that the Institute of Humanities or that you specifically are working on right now that you're excited about or want to share?
Absolutely. In some ways, it's an outgrowth of our first two maps, the queer map and the First Nation Stampede map. During this Pride Week coming up at the end of August, I think the date is August the 26th, but I could be wrong. It could be the 27th. In any case, we're having our third annual LGBTQ2S+ lecture. Yes, which Kevin introduced the first one, I think, and perhaps the second one as well. So this year we decided it was going to be born online. We couldn't take the risk of planning a live event and pulling it off again. So we decided to have a panel something like this. So we're going to have 3 young queer Indigenous voices. We're going to have Joshua Whitehead, who is a poet and novelist here from Calgary, who was just hired by the University of Calgary, who won the Canada Reads competition this year for his novel Johnny Appleseed. Billy Ray Belcourt, the youngest winner of Canada's Griffin Prize, the Poetry Prize. And then to sort of break things up a little bit, we're having musician Shawn Kish, who is a young Edmonton singer who won the CBC Songwriters competition last year. So if you're interested in this, it's free. You can go to the Calgary Institute for the Humanities webpage, sign up. You do have to sign up. It'll be this kind of a format, and we'd love to see you there for our third annual Pride Lecture.
That sounds fantastic. That's going to be an incredible program. I'm very excited about that. I will be signing up.
It's also just before I don't want to forget this, but the Atlas Project has kindly offered attendees to this panel copies of maps. So there's a way to get those in the links, I guess.
That's right. At the end.
Thank you, Jim, for that.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing. At the end, we will post a series of links that everyone can just kind of copy and paste onto a Word document or something like that, just so you can capture all of this information that we're sharing and go continue exploring. And yes, one of those things will be an email that you can contact Calgary Atlas Project and request any of these beautiful maps that our lovely Shaun Hunter is holding up right now. Really awesome opportunity. These are beautiful. They unfold, and you've seen the artwork that we've shown in the presentation tonight. So that will be a really excellent thing.
I should, if I can just say too, they're also available for sale at local Calgary independent bookstores. I mean, and I do want to put a plug in for independent bookstores. If you want them to survive, you have to go buy books there and not buy them from Amazon. Yes. I should have said an anti-Amazon thing, but nonetheless, Calgary does have some lovely bookstores, Pages, Next Story, Shelf Life,
Owl's Nest. Owl's Nest.
Owl's
Owl's
Nest. Of course, Owl's Nest also has the Atlas Project. So yes.
They're spectacular. And yes, totally agree. Here. Go out those bookstores and just spend some money there. It's an important endeavor if we want to keep that literary, component of our literary history alive in the city.
Kevin's book is available there.
And so is Shawn's.
And mine. We have to do the show and tell. There we go. Shameless self-promotion.
Self-promotion. That is your payment for being on this panel. So that's great. This is a really interesting question that came in. Shawn spoke early on about accessibility of making maps and how there are not gatekeepers to stop people from sharing these histories. What is the downside of this? i.e., is there a risk of false or incorrect information being passed along? That's a really interesting question. I mean, that's something that we grapple with at Heritage Calgary when we're doing our historic evaluations, and we're trying to find, solid resources that really underline and double underline, the stories that we're trying to tell. Are they speculation? Is it 100% true, or is it just something that somebody heard? And so taking that and applying it to the map making process, Shawn, Kevin, Jim, what do you guys think about that? What is that? It's turning into a little bit of complex territory, but who is allowed to tell these stories in this way? And are there risks and downsides of perhaps the missharing of information or the sharing of misinformation?
I'll take that one on a little bit because I've struggled with this as a historian myself. I've passed on incorrect information. So when I started the project, what I knew and what I know now are two different things. And I wrote an essay for Lougheed House a few months ago called "Who is an Authority?" Like, how is history actually made? And notwithstanding that there may be people who are sharing things with malicious intent, but even people with good intent with sources can be wrong. So it's a really good question, and there's no sort of black and white answer. Like, the truth is not as objective as we think it is. So that's a meandering answer, but that's all I got.
It is complicated. It's a very difficult thing, I think. Jim, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, in some ways, it's a parallel problem to websites, for example, which I recall in the early days as an English prof, students would go and research things and didn't have any clear sense of where that information was coming from. And you'd find out that, in fact, they had referenced, Miss Brown's grade 4 English class or something like that. Because it was on the web, it was probably true. And so I think I hope we've become a little bit more sophisticated about analyzing information that comes from the web, looking at who puts that information up and so on. And I guess one needs to do that with anything, really. Where is this information coming from? Is this a source that one can trust? Before one passes it on, I mean, you don't have to stamp it out, but you might want to evaluate. Is this a respected source that's promoting this information, and what stake do they have in this history? One of the things about academics is we're supposed to be disinterested and have no particular stake in it, which should give us more of an objectivity. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not so good. Sometimes you need a historian like Kevin, who's very much involved in that history, who's going to have access to that story in a way that an academic might not. But you have to know where the history is coming from. And so don't take anything, I guess, just on faith. Find out who's telling you the story, and give it that level of, sort of credibility, I guess.
Shawn, maybe I'll pinpoint you with that gatekeeper question, since you're the one who brought that up.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think about that? Obviously there are some situations where, it would be inappropriate for me to tell a story of, somebody who maybe I haven't lived those same shared experiences. I don't understand, the perspective that that population might have lived through or something like that. Did you come across anything like that when you were pulling your map together? Is there ever something that, an issue or a story that you came across where you're like, oh, I don't know if actually I'm the right person to share that information? To Jim's point, I mean, we are academics. They're supposed to be disinterestedly sharing information to others to allow them to kind of take up the lead and run with it, right? But what do you think about that kind of that gatekeeper quandary? Like who is the authority and who has the right to tell certain stories?
Right. It's a very tricky terrain. I think we're learning. I was at a storytelling workshop at Lougheed House a couple of weeks ago, and it was very clear the ethics of storytelling. Some tell your own story, and this is in the oral tradition, and I think it applies. But I think I feel I am also an accidental historian. I try to do the best I can. One can always be a better researcher if you hold a high standard for yourself. But I think there's a respectful way of, in my case, a literary history, I wanted to cast a very wide net. I'm not claiming those stories as my own. I'm simply putting them into the mix. I hope I'm being respectful. I'm trying to be respectful. I'm trying to document my sources and keep a trail. I don't have I think where I got in trouble with my book was that it was finite, and it was my curation. It was my selection, and I had to leave things out. And that caused more problems than including. So, it just really depends. But I think respect is very important, and care. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think just before we sign off, I'm just keeping an eye on the time there. We'll end it sort of with one. There's two more questions here. They're a little bit lighter. First one's for Jim. Will the movies map include the Calgary Film Society? Apparently, at one point, films were shown at the Jubilee Auditorium, which is not something that I was aware of. Is that something that will be on that map? It's not something that I looked at super closely, so I can't answer. So maybe you can.
Yes, definitely. The Calgary Film Society is on the map. I've got two different Calgary Film Societies in my head. One was a little independent group in the 1930s that were filmmakers. Amateur filmmakers, but I think the Calgary Film Society was later. They met at the Calgary Herald editorial offices, or boardroom rather, and the Calgary Film Society, I believe, met at Cost House, which is a mansion in
Mount Royal.
That was given to the city for various cultural purposes. So that's definitely on there, and I think that was more of a traditional film society. And yeah, the Jubilee. There were different films shown there, but there were a couple of series. One was kind of travelogue films, very popular. And another was ski films, of course, used to come through fairly regularly. I don't remember the last film that was shown there.
They also did queer films like in 1980 or 81. All the programs are in the Glenbow archives. So you can go look at the Calgary Film Society was very popular and very progressive in its day. Yeah.
And so they showed where? The Calgary Film Society showed at Cost House or at Jubilee?
I think maybe originally in Cost House, but they moved to Jubilee. They were in the lower level, I think.
Oh, okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, that Glenbow Archives, by the way, just anyone who's on this call here or this panel with us tonight who hasn't gone on to the new Glenbow Digital Archives that is now located at the University of Calgary, they've spent, I think, the pandemic, just really revamping and updating their website. It's the digital collections that was at the Glenbow, now at the University of Calgary. Just Google it, it will pop up, and you will spend hours down rabbit holes in there. It's absolutely fantastic wealth of resources about the history of this city and also more broadly around the region as well. So,
and we also can't forget the Calgary Public Library's digital map collection, which is also a lot of fun. You can go up to the 4th floor and pull all the drawers, but it's all digital as well, and the link is on lots of fun.
Absolutely, they are fantastic. And the last question here, this one here is for Shawn. Are there any popular authors that come to mind who use Calgary in their writing as a setting? I think of Gary Ryan immediately and wonder if there are others. Well,
Do I have a book for you? I can't get that right. Yes. Oh my goodness. There you go. I'm not even going to answer that question. You can go to my website too. And before the book came into being, I ran a weekly blog series with a different excerpt. Oh my goodness. There's so much literature in Calgary. Yeah.
The one that stands out for me is W.O. Mitchell, who lived in Roxborough and wrote a novel in the 80s, I believe. And the setting was in a park that was across the street from the house that he lived in. So all of these amazing ties is really, really remarkable, because you don't really think of Calgary as a city of arts and culture, let alone a literary hotspot, you know. This is something that is really fantastic to have unearthed. So it's really great. Great. Well, there's a couple of other questions here that I think were answered. What's the next map that will be completed, undertaken? Jim, we talked about the variety of maps that are coming out of the Calgary Atlas project, and a comment here about posting a Ride YYC 2020 inspired by the Calgary Bike Pathways map. So those items, yes, there's absolutely a way of doing that, and we will pursue that as well. So I think being very respectful of time, everyone has been really great with their time tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. Shawn, Jim, Kevin, you were fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for making my job extremely easy. This is the first panel I've ever moderated, and I feel like it went extremely well because you are such giving and generous panelists. So thank you so much. We'll turn it over now to Irene, as well as the library, for some closing remarks. And I just want to say thank you all so much for coming. I hope you check out more Historic Calgary Week programming throughout the week. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you all. So before we turn to Irene and her closing remarks, I would just like to say that we tried sharing the document with all the relevant links, but not sure whether that will work for everyone. So we will send an email to everyone who registered for this program after this. And the other thing is that before you leave, you will be asked to do the survey, and we would truly appreciate if you do that. Your input and your feedback is invaluable for the future programs. So thank you in advance for that. And Irene, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists. I loved the panel discussion. I loved hearing all the positions that you all had, all the contributions that you made. I loved the way that you talked about all the layering and interconnections. That's actually the way I find Historic Calgary Week. There's all these different topics, and somehow there's a connection between them all, which I find just absolutely fascinating. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. One other thing, please do look at our website to check out all our HCW programs, the virtual and in person. And you will also find a listing of all our supporters, how to join our society, and how to support our programs.